Cell Block C at the Gratage State Penitentiary was a place where time seemed frozen, where the fluorescent lights flickered above cracked concrete floors and every sound footsteps, metal clanks, muffled voices, code like ghosts trapped between the walls. The inmates had learned to adapt to the rhythm of confinement, but among them, two men stood apart, Rico Alvarez and Darren Cole. Rico was in his early 40s, a man whose calm exterior masked years of violence and regret. He had spent more than a decade behind bars for armed robbery and had earned quiet respect for keeping order among chaos. Darren, on the other hand, was barely 27, new to the system, with eyes that still carried the panic of someone not yet hardened by prison life. Their connection began as something ordinary: shared cigarettes during yard time, exchanged meals, and late-night conversations through the steel bars. But soon, those talks turned into confessions, unspoken emotions, and a reliance that neither could explain. In a world ruled by gangs and survival codes, emotional bonds were considered weakness, and yet they found comfort in each other's presence. Rico became Darren's protector, shielding him from threats and teaching him how to navigate the unwritten rules of prison life. But protection came at a cost, and in Grey Ridge, as weeks turned into months, their relationship evolved into something that defied the rigid boundaries of the prison hierarchy. Whispers began to circulate among other inmates, quiet rumors about what really happened in cell 43 after the lights went out. The guards ignored it, pretending not to see. Because in a place where violence and despair ruled, human connection, no matter how complicated, seemed harmless. What no one knew was that beneath their growing closeness, a darker truth was festering. Rico had been carrying a secret since before he was transferred to Gratage, diagnosis he never fully understood, one that filled him with shame and fear. Darren trusted him completely, never questioning the scars on his arms or the way Rico sometimes disappeared into the prison infirmary for tests. The bond that began as friendship had become a silent pact built on half-truths. Late one night, when the sirens went off after a scuffle in another block, Rico whispered to Darren through the darkness, "You can trust me. I'll never let anyone hurt you." But trust inside Grey Ridge was fragile, as thin as the thread holding together their fragile peace. By the time the sun rose the next morning, everything between them had changed. The whispers had reached the wrong ears, and jealousy in prison could be as deadly as any weapon. Darren began noticing subtle changes in Rickamood's absences, a tension he couldn't name. Then came the medical checks, the rumors of infection spreading in the facility, and the fear that their secret might destroy them both. In a place where weakness meant death, fear turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to rage. Cell Block C, once filled with meaningless noise, now held a silence that even the guards could feel. Something terrible was brewing, something that would soon stain the concrete floors in blood. By the time word began to spread across the cell blocks, Darren could feel the shift in the air, like a storm brewing inside the prison walls. Whispers were the bloodline of Grey Ridge, faster than letters, sharper than blades, and it didn't take long for rumors about cell 43 to circulate through the corridors. Some said Rico was keeping something from everyone. Others claimed Darren had crossed a line that no inmate should. In prison, gossip wasn't harmless. It was ammunition. The other prisoners watched them differently now, their glances longer, filled with curiosity and judgment. Rico tried to act like nothing had changed, walking through the yard with his usual confidence, but Darren could sense the tension rising in the group that used to respect him. It wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about survival. He started noticing small changes in Rico's behavior: missed meals, late-night coughing, visits to the infirmary that were always brushed off with vague excuses. One afternoon, during count time, a guard whispered to another that medical staff had been questioning inmates about possible infections. Darren's stomach dropped. That night, when Rico finally returned to the cell, Darren confronted him in a low, trembling voice. "You're hiding something from me," he said, his words swallowed by the hum of flickering lights. Rico didn't respond immediately. His silence said everything. After a long pause, he finally muttered, "It's nothing you can't handle. Just keep your head down." But the truth, like everything else in Greyridge, had a way of breaking through. Within days, Darren began to feel unwell, nothing severe at first, just exhaustion, fever, and an ache that wouldn't go away. Fear gnawed at him, but what scared him more was Rico's reaction. He became distant, colder, almost protective in a different way, as if trying to shield Darren from something he couldn't admit. The medical unit was soon placed under investigation after reports of multiple inmates testing positive for an infection that should have never entered the facility. Guards whispered, inmates speculated, and suspicion turned into hostility. Darren's name began appearing in conversations he couldn't hear fully, but felt in every glance thrown his way. It was no longer about trust, it was about danger. The fragile balance of their secret bond had tipped, and both men knew it. Late one night, when the power went out across the block during a storm, Darren woke to find Rico sitting by the bars, staring into the darkness. "You should have told me," Darren said quietly. Rico didn't turn around. "I thought I could protect you," he whispered, his voice cracking with something between guilt and sorrow. The lightning outside flashed through the tiny window, illuminating the raw fear on both their faces. Outside the cell, footsteps echoed, voices shouted orders, and chaos erupted in the block as guards tried to restore power. Darren realized, in that moment, that whatever secret Rico was keeping had already begun to destroy them. The infection, the whispers, the betrayal, they had all become one tangled truth that would soon explode. And as the alarms blared again, signaling another lockdown, Darren understood the unthinkable. Inside Greyridge, survival wasn't about strength anymore. It was about who you could still trust when the world turned against you. The storm that rattled Greyridge that night didn't just cut the power. It broke whatever fragile sense of safety Darren had left. The following morning, guards marched through the blocks, their boots echoing across the concrete as the smell of disinfectant filled the air. Rumors had reached the warden's office, and medical officers began pulling inmates one by one for testing. Darren sat on the edge of his bunk, heart pounding, watching Rico pace the narrow space between the bunks like a caged animal. "They're testing everyone," Darren said, his voice low, trembling. Rico didn't respond at first, but the flicker of panic in his eyes was unmistakable. He stopped pacing and turned toward Darren, his face hardened by years of hiding behind silence. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, you keep your mouth shut." Those words hit Darren like a punch. All the late-night talks, the promises, the whispered reassurances, they now felt hollow, dangerous. When Darren's name was called later that day, he followed the guard to the infirmary, where a nurse took blood samples and handed him a small paper cup of water. The room smelled of bleach and fear. By the time he returned to his cell, Rico was gone. Panic began to set in, creeping up his spine like ice water. Hours turned into days before Rico was seen again, his face pale and his eyes sunken. When Darren confronted him, Rico finally broke. He confessed not loudly, not dramatically, but in a voice so low that Darren had to lean in to hear. "I was positive before I came here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They tested me years ago. I thought it didn't matter anymore." Darren froze. The words didn't seem real. "You knew," he said, disbelief and anger battling inside him. Rico nodded slowly. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I thought I could protect you. I thought if I kept quiet, it would die with me." The air in the cell grew thick, suffocating. Darren's heartbeat thundered in his ears. "You lied to me," he whispered. Rico's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. "I saved your life in here, Darren. You have no idea what they would have done to you if they knew." But Darren couldn't hear reason anymore. The betrayal had consumed everything. That night, while the rest of the block drifted into uneasy sleep, Darren sat awake, staring at the bars that now felt like the edges of a coffin. Every whisper in the dark felt aimed at him. Every sound of footsteps outside felt like judgment. When Rico finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from his confession, Darren sat up and stared at him in the dim light. 1,000 thoughts rushed through his mind: rage, grief, fear, but above all, a chilling clarity. The next day, he avoided Rico completely, staying silent during meals, ignoring his attempts to explain. He spent hours in the yard, pacing in circles, trying to make sense of a world where trust had become poison. When he finally looked up at the gray sky through the barbed wire, he realized there was no escape from what had been done. Inside those walls, justice wasn't decided by courts or judges, it was settled by survival. And Darren, broken and betrayed, began to understand what that truly meant. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in cell block C grew heavier with every passing hour. Darren's silence had become its own kind of noise, louder than the clanging of metal doors or the shouting of guards. Rico felt it every time he looked across the small space between their bunks, the absence of words, the cold stare of a man who once trusted him with his life. The secret he had carried for years had finally turned into a ticking bomb, one that threatened to destroy them both. Other inmates had begun to notice the change. They could sense when something inside a cell was breaking apart. It was like the scent of blood to wolves. The whispers returned, sharper this time, mixed with laughter and cruelty. "Rico's boy doesn't talk anymore," one of them sneered in the mess hall. Darren ignored it, but every word dug deeper. He avoided eye contact, ate in silence, and spent his yard time pacing along the outer fence, staring at the gray sky as if it could offer an escape. Inside, he was falling apart. The infection rumors had turned into an investigation, and guards were questioning inmates, trying to trace how it had spread. Darren lived in constant fear of his results, dreading the day when he would be called into the infirmary for confirmation. Rico tried to reach out, leaving small notes under Darren's pillow or sharing extra food, but every gesture was met with cold indifference. The bond that had once been his only comfort now felt like a curse. One evening, while the block was locked down after a fight, a guard named Keller stopped at their cell. He was one of those officers who enjoyed stirring trouble. "So," he said, smirking, "heard you two have been keeping secrets." Darren froze, while Rico clenched his fists. Keller leaned closer to the bars. "You know, rumors like that can get a man killed in here." He laughed and walked away, but the damage was done. By the next morning, the entire block seemed to be watching them. The tension boiled over during yard time when a group of inmates cornered Darren by the fence. "You're dirty," one of them hissed, shoving him. Before Darren could react, Rico appeared, shoving the attacker back with a force that made the others scatter. It was over in seconds, but the message was clear. Things were spiraling out of control. That night, Darren confronted Rico again, his voice breaking with rage. "You don't get to protect me anymore," he shouted. "You did this." Rico didn't argue. He stood there, defeated, his face etched with guilt. "I never wanted this for you," he said softly. "I was trying to keep you alive." But in Grey Ridge, intentions meant nothing. By morning, the guards had transferred Rico to solitary confinement for his own safety. Though everyone knew it was too late. Darren was left alone in the cell that still smelled like him, haunted by the echoes of their past and the weight of a truth too heavy to carry. The silence became unbearable. In the darkness, Darren realized that something inside him had snapped. He had spent months clinging to trust, then to anger, and now all that was left was emptiness. As he lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the fluorescent lights above him felt like a countdown. Something terrible was coming, and deep down, he knew he was the one who would decide when it would end. The morning after Rico's transfer to solitary confinement, Grattidge felt strangely quiet, as if the entire prison was holding its breath. Darren sat on his bunk, staring at the empty space across from him where Rico's presence had once filled the silence. The walls seemed to echo his thoughts, whispering memories he wished he could erase. He told himself he hated Rico now, that he wanted nothing more than to forget him, but hatred in Grattidge was never clean. It always carried a shadow of what came before. As the days passed, the isolation gnawed at Darren's sanity. Without Rico, he had no shield, no sense of belonging. Other inmates kept their distance, some out of fear, others out of suspicion. Even the guards looked at him differently, their eyes full of unspoken accusations. One afternoon, during a routine count, Darren caught a glimpse of Rico being escorted through the corridor toward the infirmary. Their eyes met for a split second, Draco's filled with regret, Darren's with confusion and rage. That look burned into him, fueling something dark that had been festering since the night of the confession. Later that evening, a note was slipped under his cell door. It was written in Rico's handwriting, "I'm sorry. You'll understand one day." Darren tore it to pieces. He didn't want apologies. He wanted answers. He wanted justice. The following night, during lockdown, chaos erupted in another block, shouting alarms, the metallic ring of batons on bars. Amid the noise, Darren heard something that froze him, a guard yelling Rico's name. Within minutes, the block filled with the smell of smoke and panic as officers rushed past his cell. He pressed his face to the bars, trying to see. But all he caught was the glimpse of a stretcher rolling by under dim emergency lights. The body was covered But Darren knew. The air around him grew heavy, thick with disbelief. Rico was dead. Rumors spread faster than the sirens could stop them. Some said it was suicide. Others whispered he'd been attacked in solitary. The truth was buried under layers of lies and indifference. Darren felt a storm rising inside him, a mix of guilt, relief, and hollow anger that made it hard to breathe. He spent that night sitting on the floor, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of what had happened. He remembered every word Rico had said, every promise, every warning. The infection, the secrets, the fear, it had all led to this. The next morning, when the warden announced the death as unexplained, Darren felt something inside him break. He realized that Greyridge had swallowed another soul, and this time it had taken the only person who had ever seen him as more than a number. As days turned into nights, something in him began to shift. He stopped talking altogether, stopped eating, stopped caring. The other inmates avoided his cell now. They said there was something cold in his eyes, something that didn't belong to the living anymore. And in a way, they were right. Because in the quiet hours before dawn, when the lights flickered and the guards made their rounds, Darren would whisper into the darkness, speaking to someone who was no longer there. "You said you'd protect me," he murmured one night, his voice breaking. "Now, who's going to protect them from me?" It was in that moment that the blood on the bars became inevitable. Greyridge State Penitentiary woke to silence the morning after Rico's death. A silence so complete that even the guards spoke in whispers. Word traveled fast, yet no one claimed to know exactly what had happened. Some said he was found alone in his solitary cell. Others swore they heard shouting before the lights went out. The official report called it an incident under review. But everyone knew those words meant one thing: something had gone terribly wrong. Darren sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the cracks in the floor, unable to decide whether he felt grief or relief. He had dreamed of freedom, of leaving Rico and the infection rumors behind. But now that freedom felt poisoned. Within hours, investigators from the Department of Corrections arrived, wearing clean suits and detached expressions, treating every inmate like a potential suspect. They questioned Darren first. The warden watched from the corner of the room as a detective named Marlowe slid a recorder across the table and asked the question Darren had been dreading. "When was the last time you spoke to Rico Alvarez?" His throat tightened. He wanted to tell them everything. The lies, the fear, the infection, but something inside stopped him. Snitching in Greyridge was another kind of death. "We didn't talk much after he went to solitary," Darren said finally. Marlowe studied him for a long time, then leaned back. "He mentioned your name before he was moved. Said you were the only one he trusted." The words struck Darren like cold water. Trusted. The one thing Rico had destroyed was now the only thing that tied them together. As the days passed, the investigation widened. Guards were interviewed, medical records reviewed, and the infirmary sealed for inspection. Rumors twisted into theories. Some said Rico had taken his own life out of guilt. Others whispered that someone wanted him silenced. Every version left Darren more isolated. He was transferred temporarily to another block for his safety, but the new inmates treated him like a contagion, avoiding his gaze as if whatever had haunted cell 43 might spread through the air. At night, he lay awake listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, hearing the echoes of Rico's voice in every creak of metal. The guilt clawed at him, whispering that he had killed the only person who ever cared about him, not with his hands, but with silence. One evening, Detective Marlowe returned. "You know," he said, placing a folder on the table, "sometimes the truth in here isn't about who did what. It's about who can live with it." He pushed a sheet of paper toward Darren, a signed statement from a guard who had seen Rico arguing with someone from the medical staff hours before his death. "We think he was trying to confess something," Marlowe continued. "Maybe he wanted to clear his name." Darren stared at the page until the words blurred. He realized the story wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Rico's death had opened a door, and behind it lay everything the prison wanted to hide: negligence, corruption, silence. As Marlowe left the room, Darren looked through the small window at the gray yard beyond the bars. For the first time since arriving at Greyridge, he felt a spark of something that wasn't fear or anger, was resolve. Rico's secret had destroyed them, but perhaps uncovering the truth could set one of them free, even if only in memory. The day the investigation shifted, the air in Greyridge felt different, more alert, more watchful, as if the entire building knew secrets were being unearthed. Darren was summoned to the administrative wing, a place inmates rarely saw unless trouble was coming. Detective Marlowe met him there, his tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes from too many nights spent combing through reports. Without preamble, he dropped a thin stack of papers on the table. "These are medical transfer logs," he said quietly. "According to this, Rico Alvarez was never supposed to be in your block." Darren frowned, unsure whether it was confusion or dread tightening in his chest. Marlowe leaned closer. "He was moved there 2 months before his file was updated. Someone bypassed protocol." The words hung heavy in the stale air. It wasn't just an administrative error, was manipulation. Someone had placed Rico exactly where they wanted him. Darren's pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages, each line of typed text a breadcrumb leading nowhere. There were missing dates, forged signatures, even an erased diagnosis entry replaced with the word confidential. Marlowe's voice was low, deliberate. "Whoever did this was covering something up. We think Rico found out hand. That's why he's dead." Darren stared at the papers until the letters blurred into static. A guard entered, murmured that time was up, and escorted him back through the echoing corridors. The smell of disinfectant burned his nose. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step. That night, he couldn't sleep. The discovery gnawed at him, reshaping his grief into anger. Rico hadn't just been reckless, he'd been used. Maybe by the system, maybe by someone inside it. The next morning, Darren requested to speak with the prison chaplain, claiming he needed confession. Instead, he slipped a note into the chaplain's Bible during their meeting. "Find Marlowe. Tell him Block C guards are hiding something." The message reached the detective within a day. Soon, Internal Affairs arrived, questioning staff who had never been questioned before. Guards whispered among themselves. Officers double-checked their reports, and suddenly the unspoken code of silence began to fracture. One evening, as Darren returned from the workshop, he noticed Keller, the guard, who had once mocked him, being led away in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly. Keller's face was pale, not with guilt, but fear. Later that night, Marlowe appeared at Darren's cell, speaking through the bars in a hushed tone. "You were right," he said. Keller moved Rico's file. He was paid to keep quiet about something in the infirmary logs, experimental meds, unreported cases. "We're still digging." Darren gripped the bars, the cold metal biting into his skin. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt the weight of truth pressing closer. Yet, with it came danger. Word of his cooperation spread fast, and by morning the whispers returned, sharper than ever. "Snitch," someone hissed as he passed. Another voice followed, "He's next." Fear crept in again, but beneath it pulsed a strange calm. Darren realized he no longer cared about survival in the way he once had. If Rico's death meant anything, it was this: the truth had to surface, no matter the cost. That night, lightning flashed outside the tiny window of his cell, casting fractured light across the papers Marlowe had slipped him through the bars. He traced Rico's name with his fingertip and whispered, "They can't bury you again." In that single moment, surrounded by darkness and the hum of the prison beyond, Darren stopped being a victim. He became the one chasing answers. Days blurred into each other as the investigation deepened, but for Darren, time moved differently. Each minute felt like a step closer to a storm he couldn't escape. The prison had changed since Keller's arrest. Tension pulsed through the corridors like an electric current. Guards avoided eye contact. Inmates whispered in corners. And even the warden's footsteps seemed quieter, as though the entire facility was holding its breath. Darren felt it, to the uneasy sense that eyes followed him everywhere. One evening, during head count, a crumpled piece of paper slipped under his cell door. "Stop talking, or you'll end up like him." No name, no handwriting he recognized, just the words, stark and final. He tore it up immediately, but the message stayed lodged in his mind like a splinter. The next morning, Detective Marlowe requested another meeting. He looked older, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of something he hadn't yet said. The investigations hit a wall, he admitted, spreading out new photographs on the table, images of storage rooms, empty vials, and infirmary shelves stripped bare. Whatever they were doing here, it's been cleaned up. Someone higher up's protecting this. Darren leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Then go higher," he said. But Marlowe shook his head. "It's not that simple. The prisons owned by a private contractor accords vanish when money's involved." Silence filled the room until the detective's voice softened. "You did good, Darren, but you need to keep your head down. Someone's angry you talked." As Darren was led back to his cell, he noticed two inmates staring from the end of the hall, faces he didn't recognize, eyes cold, predatory. He understood then that danger no longer came from the system alone. It was in the air he breathed, in the people around him, in every flicker of shadow across the concrete walls. That night, the lights went out earlier than usual. The darkness felt deliberate. From somewhere down the block, metal scraped against metal, a signal, or maybe a warning. Darren gripped the edge of his bunk, every muscle tensed, waiting for movement. Minutes stretched into hours. When the power finally returned, a faint smear of red marked the floor outside his cell, someone else's blood. The guards rushed through the halls, shouting orders, but Darren stayed silent, staring at the streak like it was an omen. The next day, Marlowe didn't show. No messages, no visits, nothing. Word spread that he'd been suspended for misconduct, though everyone knew that meant he'd gotten too close. Darren felt the walls closing in again, the thin line between truth and survival snapping thread by thread. Then, late that night, a soft knock echoed from the vent near his bed. A whisper followed female urgent. "Don't trust anyone. Check Rico's locker." The voice was gone before he could answer. Rico's locker was supposed to be sealed since the investigation, but if someone had left it open, there had to be a reason. Darren's mind raced through possibilities. The next morning, during work duty, he managed to slip past the infirmary corridor and reach the storage area. The locker stood slightly ajar, the metal rusted, and the number 27 scratched deep into its door. Inside, wrapped in an old shirt, was a small USB drive. His hands trembled as he hid it beneath his uniform. That night, back in his cell, he stared at it under the dim light, realizing this wasn't over, it was just beginning. Rico hadn't died for nothing. The truth was right there, locked inside that tiny piece of plastic, waiting to explode. Darren couldn't sleep. Every sound in the block footsteps echoing against concrete. The low hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clatter of metal doors felt amplified, each one a warning. He kept the USB drive hidden beneath his uniform, a tiny lifeline connecting him to the truth Rico had tried to leave behind. Over the next several days, he worked cautiously, waiting for a moment alone to examine its contents. When the guard's attention faltered during a routine lockdown, he slipped into the library, the only place with a functioning computer. His fingers shook as he inserted the drive, and the screen flickered to life, revealing documents, spreadsheets, and encrypted messages. Each file was a fragment of a conspiracy, unreported medical experiments, falsified infection logs, and payments to certain staff to keep everything under wraps. The names made him shiver. Some were people he had seen every day walking past him without a hint of guilt. He realized the situation was larger than Greyjudge itself. Money, corruption, and fear had turned the prison into a cage, not only of concrete, but of lies. For hours, Darren pored over the files, his heart racing with every revelation. There were dates, times, and coded instructions indicating that Rico had discovered the truth just weeks before his death. Someone had been monitoring him, and the moment the secret came close to exposure, Rico had been silenced, not with guns or knives, but with a system that could crush anyone who got too close. Darren leaned back, his mind reeling. The infection rumors, the whispered threats, the mysterious messages, they were all part of a cover-up. For the first time, he understood that survival required more than avoidance. It required action, cunning, and courage. He needed allies, but trust in Greyjudge was currency too expensive to spend freely. Over the next week, Darren began observing the movements of guards, staff, and inmates alike. He memorized routines, noting when corridors were empty, when cameras shifted, when doors could be accessed without oversight. Each small detail added to a growing map in his mind, a blueprint for navigating the danger around him. And yet, paranoia had its price. He saw threats everywhere, a shadow behind a column, a hand brushing against a rail, the faintest glance from a fellow inmate. Sleep became a stranger, replaced by calculation and quiet dread. One night, as the block fell silent, except for the occasional clanging of a distant door, Darren sat on the edge of his bunk, the USB drive in his hand. The files glowed faintly under the dim light, revealing the cold truth that had cost Rico his life. He whispered into the darkness, "I won't let them erase you." The prison seemed to hold its breath in response, as though the walls themselves understood that the balance had shifted. Darren was no longer merely a survivor. He was a keeper of secrets, a man who had glimpsed the machinery of corruption and could not unsee it. And in that moment, every echo of the past, every whisper from the shadows, became a call to action, warning him that the final chapter of this nightmare was approaching. The tension in cell block C was no longer just about fear. It was about inevitability. Someone, somewhere, knew that the truth was alive, pulsing in Darren's hands. And the moment it surfaced, it would change everything inside the prison and beyond. Greyage State Penitentiary had never felt quieter. And yet Darren sensed that the stillness was deceptive, a calm before an inevitable storm. The USB drive rested heavily in his pocket, a small but powerful artifact containing everything that had been hidden for months: the falsified medical logs, the internal memos, the coded messages that revealed a conspiracy beyond the walls of cell block C. He knew the moment he revealed its contents, nothing would ever be the same for the prison, for the staff, for the inmates who had silently suffered under the weight of lies. Over the next several days, he planned carefully, observing routines, memorizing guard rotations, and identifying allies who might survive the fallout with him. Every choice was calculated. One misstep could erase him, just as it had erased Rico. When he finally presented the evidence to Detective Marlowe, who had quietly returned after suspension, the air in the small room seemed to thicken. Marlowe's eyes widened as he scrolled through the files, realizing the full scope of corruption: private contractors paid to cover up medical experiments, forged documents that misrepresented inmate health, and a chain of command that had allowed Rico's death to be hidden behind bureaucracy and fear. "This is bigger than Greyridge," Marlowe said, his voice barely above a whisper. Darren nodded, the tension in his shoulders heavy but resolute. "Then let's make sure it comes out," he replied. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded beyond the prison walls. Internal affairs coordinated with outside oversight committees. Auditors combed through financial records, and legal teams prepared to prosecute those responsible. Within Greyridge, whispers became certainty as guards and inmates alike realized the cage of secrecy was finally cracking. Darren watched from his bunk, cautious yet determined, aware that, though the system was slow, truth had a momentum all its own. In the evenings, he walked the yard alone, feeling the wind against the barbed wire, knowing that while he had survived the internal terror, the psychological toll remained. Nights were hardest. He replayed Rico's last days in his mind, remembering the whispered confessions, the silent promises, the weight of trust that had been betrayed. Yet, amidst the grief and guilt, he also felt a strange clarity. He had become more than an observer. He had become a guardian of truth, someone who could ensure that Rico's death, though tragic, would serve as a catalyst for accountability. By the time the legal proceedings began, Darren was moved to a different block for protection, but the prison never felt as oppressive. The secrets he carried were no longer solely his burden. They had grown wings in the hands of those who would see justice done. And as he sat one night under the faint glow of the hallway lights, he allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Greyridge had taken much from him, his friend, his trust, his innocence, but it could not take the truth. The final chapter of horror had passed, but the story of corruption, silence, and survival would resonate far beyond the walls. Darren knew the path forward would be challenging, that the memories would linger. But he also knew one crucial fact: Rico's voice, silenced too soon, would finally be heard, echoing in every report, every courtroom, and every heart determined to confront the darkness that had once thrived unchecked. And in that moment, standing at the edge of cell block C, Darren understood that survival was not simply about enduring, it was about ensuring that the truth endured long after the walls had fallen silent.